On January 14, 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron issued what many African analysts now call the most aggressive ultimatum from Paris since colonial withdrawal. According to diplomatic sources across Paris, Ouagadougou, and ECOWAS corridors, the message was clear. Burkina Faso has exactly 7 days to repay an alleged debt of 8.4 billion or face severe consequences. But this was not a polite financial request. This was a threat wrapped in legal language. Stay with us to find out what happened exactly. French officials reportedly conveyed two options to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Options that many now describe as economic blackmail. Option 1. Immediate repayment of 8.4 billion. France demanded that Burkina Faso clear the entire debt within 7 days, despite decades of resource extraction and unequal contracts that benefited Paris more than Ouagadougou. But here's the twist. Burkina Faso does not even acknowledge this number as legitimate. There is no public record of Burkina Faso receiving 8.4 billion in usable aid. What France calls development loans, many Burkinabe economists call colonial accounting tricks. So how can a nation repay money it never truly saw? Option 2. Hand over national assets. If repayment was impossible, France reportedly offered a settlement alternative. Surrender long-term control of 60% of Burkina Faso's industrial gold output, and transfer 5 million hectares of agricultural land to French-linked corporations. To put that into perspective, if million hectares equals nearly half of Burkina Faso's arable land, 60% of industrial gold production would effectively place Burkina Faso's primary export under foreign ownership for generations. One African strategist summarized it simply: France is not asking for repayment. It is asking to recolonize. The countdown begins. Macron's message was not delivered publicly. It was conveyed through a private diplomatic channel, with the expectation that Traoré would quietly comply, just as previous leaders had for decades. But Captain Traoré, Africa's youngest head of state, forged not in bureaucracy but on front-line battlefields against terrorism, did not respond immediately. He did not hold a press conference. He did not call for emergency negotiations. Instead, he went silent, a silence that many in Paris mistook for hesitation. But in Ouagadougou, that silence felt calculated, controlled, dangerous, because those who follow Traoré's leadership style know he does not respond under pressure. He waits for the perfect moment, and then he strikes publicly. So the world waited. Would he accept the $8.4 billion debt and impose austerity on his already struggling citizens? Would he surrender half his nation's gold to maintain diplomatic peace? Would he allow millions of hectares of Burkinabe soil to be placed under foreign corporations? Or would he reject the ultimatum, risking everything? 7 days. That was the window Emmanuel Macron reportedly gave Burkina Faso. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not respond on day 1. Not on day 2. Not even on day 6. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategic pause. A silence that forced Paris to wait, uncertain whether their ultimatum had been received, rejected, or ignored. Then finally, on day 7, just as French media began speculating about secret compliance, Traoré appeared on national television, but not in a diplomatic suit, not with flags of foreign nations behind him, not in Paris, Brussels, or Geneva. He appeared in military fatigues, standing before ordinary Burkinabe citizens and soldiers, not diplomats. There was no French interpreter present, no international press, only African ears, and instead of addressing Macron by name, Traoré delivered a message without a direct recipient, yet unmistakably targeted. Traoré stated, "Burkina Faso does not owe anyone anything for its own resources. If past leaders signed agreements that served foreign interests, those signatures do not bind our sovereignty. No anger, no theatrics, no insults, just a rewrite of the ledger." Then he added, "If certain governments believe they can issue financial threats in exchange for our land or gold, let them come and take it themselves." The statement was not shouted, but delivered like a legal verdict. Traoré did not deny that an ultimatum was sent. He did not attempt to negotiate. he did the one thing Paris did not expect. He treated the ultimatum as void, not as a proposal, but as a non-legitimate document from a non-relevant authority. For the French establishment, this silence-turned-surgical rebuke was worse than an insult. Why? Because Macron's ultimatum relied on recognition of France's authority. Traoré's response denied that authority entirely. Within 24 hours, the response had circulated across African networks, not through mainstream media, but through WhatsApp voice notes in Mali, radio stations in Niger, street speeches in Chad, TikTok edits in Senegal. African citizens did not debate who was right or wrong. They celebrated one simple fact. For the first time in decades, a sitting African president had rejected a French decree without diplomatic language. Even non-Francophone countries like Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa began holding panel discussions asking, if Burkina Faso can refuse, why are we still negotiating from weakness? Interestingly, neither ECOWAS nor the African Union issued an immediate statement. Officially, they said nothing. Unofficially, they waited to see whether France would retaliate, because if Paris struck back, they would need to choose: defend Traoré and risk political rupture with France, or remain neutral and risk losing credibility with African citizens. Either way, the ultimatum had now expanded beyond financial dispute. French insiders reportedly described the mood inside the Élysée Palace as frustration mixed with hesitation. With Traoré's televised response now circulating across Africa, the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in years, France was no longer dictating terms. It was reacting. But Paris could not afford to appear defeated, nor could it launch an open confrontation without alienating the entire continent. So Emmanuel Macron reportedly initiated a three-pronged strategy designed to pressure Burkina Faso quietly, without triggering continental backlash. Rather than impose direct French sanctions, which would be unpopular and politically risky, Paris allegedly began coordinating quietly with ECOWAS financial institutions to 1. Delay regional payment transfers to Burkina Faso. 2. Restrict currency liquidity via the CFA franc network. 3. Pressure neighboring countries to avoid new trade agreements with Ouagadougou. The goal was clear: make Burkina Faso feel economic pain without France publicly taking responsibility. However, there was a problem. Burkina Faso was no longer dependent on ECOWAS-controlled channels. After forming the AES alliance with Mali and Niger, Traoré had already diversified trade routes and strengthened military and economic ties with Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So while France attempted to squeeze Ouagadougou quietly, the effect was limited. Unable to win economically, France turned to its most reliable historical weapon: narrative control. French media outlets began publishing concern pieces, suggesting Burkina Faso risks isolation under Captain Traoré. Sahel juntas threaten regional stability. Gold revenue mismanaged under military rule. But the African population had grown immune to such headlines. Having seen similar media attacks on Thomas Sankara, Gaddafi, and even South Africa under Mandela, many now recognized the pattern. When an African leader refuses external control, Western media suddenly discovers dictatorship. Thus, what was meant to undermine Traoré's legitimacy instead strengthened his image as a defiant sovereign. France then attempted to rally international institutions to distance themselves from Burkina Faso. The IMF and World Bank were encouraged to reconsider funding allocations. The European Union signaled it would re-evaluate security cooperation. The U.S. State Department issued cautious remarks about monitoring developments. Yet once again, the impact was muted. Burkina Faso had already begun reducing its dependency on Western finance, opting instead for bilateral agreements with non-Western states, strengthened gold sales directly to Asian and Middle Eastern buyers, reduce vulnerability to European-controlled commodity markets. Open negotiations for alternative currency settlements outside the CFA franc undermine French leverage over monetary policy. Increased military coordination with Mali and Niger through the AES alliance send a deterrent signal that destabilization would trigger regional response, accelerated nationalization of strategic mines, prevent foreign seizure through legal channels. France expected compliance or chaos. Instead, it triggered resilience and reorganization. The ultimatum was meant to remind Burkina Faso of its place in the old order. Instead, it exposed that the old order is crumbling. France had expected another quiet signature, another hidden concession, another African leader willing to bend for the sake of stability. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of one of the world's poorest yet most defiant nations, did not bend, he recalibrated. This confrontation is no longer about one country's debt. It has become a referendum on the future of African sovereignty. Is Africa still negotiating from weakness, or starting to negotiate from power? Burkina Faso is not economically dominant. It is not militarily superior. Its GDP cannot compete with France's budget of a single province. Yet, something fundamental has shifted. For the first time in modern history, legitimacy no longer comes from Western approval, but from African public loyalty. France still has banks, corporations, and influence. But Traoré has something Paris can no longer manufacture: faith. By refusing to submit to Macron's 7-day demand, Traoré sent a precedent-setting signal to every leader on the continent. Can a nation reject Western debt pressure? No. Consequences are too severe. Yes, if sovereignty is defended collectively. Can an African state refuse land or resource concessions? Only in secret, rarely. Publicly, and gain support for doing so. Can economic threats be resisted without disaster? Conventional wisdom said no. Traoré proved hesitation is a weapon too. Analysts in Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea are now referring to Traoré's strategy as the Sahel Doctrine. 1. A new style of African statecraft built on 1. Rejecting illegitimate debt. 2. Nationalizing strategic resources. 3. Building military alliances independent from Western oversight. 4. Using public opinion as a shield against foreign retaliation. Whether one agrees with Traoré or not, it is clear Africa is no longer afraid to make France uncomfortable. Now France must decide: reassert control with harsher measures, risking global condemnation and revolt across Francophone Africa. Attempt quiet reconciliation, but at the price of acknowledging that Paris no longer dictates unchallenged terms. Neither path is easy. Because if Macron strikes hard, Traoré becomes a martyr. And if Macron retreats, Traoré becomes a symbol. This is not about one ultimatum, not about 8.4 billion, not about 60% of gold or 5 million hectares of land. This is about a single, irreversible truth. Africa has reached a point where silence feels more dangerous than defiance. So the question is no longer, will Traoré survive this confrontation? But rather, will the colonial model survive Traoré? If you believe Africa deserves true sovereignty, stay informed, stay vocal, and stay united. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter.